Hello, everyone. So, the topic of this monologue is what could we have done to stop the coronavirus? So, as you can imagine, whenever we ask a counterfactual like this, it's always a philosophical question. It's not really a practical question. Why? Because the fact that we didn't stop it means that there couldn't have been anything that we could have done. Because if we could, we would have done it, obviously. So, we just didn't know, or we were not motivated, or whatever reason we didn't do it, and therefore we couldn't have done it. Okay, so if you understand really if you studied some philosophy, then you would know the truth of what I just said. But it's still worth, as a mind exercise, to ruminate over this question: what could we have done? So the first thing is that the first thing I should say in this regard is that the WHO, the World Health Organization, committed a very, very grave sin. Remember that the WHO told us in the beginning, they didn't say nothing. And remember, the WHO's responsibility is not just to take reports from member nations as to infectious diseases that are taking place within their borders and just report it to other nations. It's also to actively investigate and pursue this. Okay, that's their job, the World Health Organization. They're responsible for world health. Okay, so it's not just, I'm just going to wait here in my office and I'm going to wait for Beijing to report that they're having of the virus. They need to pursue it independently, and they didn't. But not only that, when Beijing finally reported that, this is a serious issue, they still massaged the information in favor of Beijing politically, and more specifically, underestimating the extent of the problem, the transmissibility of the problem, etc. Remember that the WHO told us that it's not transmissible by human. And that is the craziest thing ever. I think that the very first time that any intelligent person, any doctor, anyone, if you hear such a thing, you know that this organization is nuts, because you know that it's not true. This makes no sense at all. In any universe, it doesn't make any sense. Remember, this is part of the coronavirus family. It's not on its own. It's not like a whole completely new breed. And so for you to say, it's not transmissible by human, why not? It's the same family all other coronaviruses are. And secondly, the reason it doesn't make sense is that how did the first people get it? Are you telling me all of these people got it from an animal? And if that's the case, if the virus can jump from an animal to a human, then it could certainly jump from human to human. So it doesn't make any sense at all. Not logically, not theoretically, not practically. In no way does it make sense. So if you're listening to the WHO saying this, then you should immediately be suspicious. There's something wrong here. Which brings me to the other thing. So point number one is that the WHO could have prevented this from doing their job properly. Instead, one, it rested on its laurels, didn't do its job, and secondly, it favored Beijing. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the CDC. So like I said, the CDC was also asleep at the wheel here, because like I said, for the CDC to accept WHO's disregard of this problem, again, it should have been an immediate red flag. The moment they said it's not humanly transmissible, they said this, I think, in mid-February or whatever they said that, they should have immediately, the CDC, and they do have capable people who are impartial, they should have immediately said, okay, so we know we can't trust them. Okay, we don't necessarily have to openly say so, but we know that they're lying and they're covering up something for whatever reason. And so, sorry guys, I have a sinus infection. Okay, so the CDC should have immediately strategized what to do here. Obviously, they need to investigate this, and they need to find out what's going on, how transmissible is it, how severe, how dangerous is it, how mortal it is, etc., and then what to do about it. So what could we have done? One thing we could have done is we could have shut down the border. So we did, in fact, do that. But the big problem with that executive order that Trump issued, I believe it was January 29 or January 30th, is that, first of all, it only applied to China. And at that time, many Chinese people who were infected had already left to European countries. So if you only shut off entry from China, but not from Europe, then you haven't accomplished anything. But I think even more importantly, you're still allowing anyone who has a green card or is an American citizen, you're allowing them to return. I am not sure if at that point they required them to quarantine. I am not 100% sure about that. But even if they do, that's not really effective. You can't just tell someone you have to quarantine yourself. At that point, remember, people were not as crazy about this Wuhan coronavirus as they are right now. So at that point, people would not have taken this seriously. So if you just tell an American who was in China, especially if they themselves think they were not exposed, and you tell them, oh, you have to quarantine yourself for 14 days. Yeah, okay. I'm going to sign the document. There you go. I promise. And then they're not going to do anything. So I think a more effective strategy would have been for the government to provide the actual lodging, the government to rent a hotel, and you can be within the grounds of the hotel, like a good hotel, a campus type of hotel. Right? You don't have to stay in your room. There's grounds. There's areas where you can work out. You can go outdoors, etc. But you're staying within the compound, and you stay there for 14 days for anyone who returns from China. So if you're a Chinese citizen, sorry, you can't enter the country. If you are an American or a green card holder, then at the government's expense, you have to stay in this compound for 14 days to see if you develop symptoms. But like I said, this problem with the Europeans, and if you do take the next step and you say that no Europeans who have been to China, like I said, that's not really effective either, because once you are in Europe and you are from a country that didn't close off the border with China, then that person could be infected. You see what I'm saying? So it doesn't work at all. You can't, of course, close the borders of every European country. That would be insane. I guess it's doable, but I'm just saying, like, it just makes it so much more, it makes the action so much more extreme. And remember, you're doing all this without any serious infection domestically. Okay, the whole thing is, the title of this video is what we could have done, right? Namely, before this got out of control. So at that point, it's hard. I mean, even though theoretically we could have done this, but we didn't have the information and the political will to take such draconian action at such an early stage of the epidemic/pandemic. So realistically speaking, this is not something we would have done. Okay, from one country maybe, but we're not going to shut off every single border. Okay, so which brings me to the next question. Once it became obvious that there are people here within this country that are infected, what do we do then? Okay, so now we've missed two chances. The WHO didn't do its job. Now there's a lot of people who are not only in Europe and China who are infected, but now even people within our own country are infected. What do we do now to contain the spread? So one idea could have been, since the early spread was in Washington State and in New York, what we could have done is we could have simply closed the border of those states. So there's two ways of doing this. One way is for the state governor of New York forbidding people from leaving. I think that's I don't like that. From a standpoint of liberty, you can't keep. That's basically imprisoning someone, right? You can't leave. I mean, who does that? Imagine America says you can't leave U.S. soil. They can't do that to me. I'm a free person. I can do whatever I want. So, but the other more legal way to do this is for the other states to say, we're not accepting people from New York. Okay, that's a lot more sensible. And I know a lot of people thinking, oh, this is crazy for a state to saying we're not going to accept New Yorkers, but it actually isn't. Remember that the primary political sovereignty in this country lies with the state, not the federal government, with the state. My primary government is not Washington. It is Tallahassee in Florida. Okay, that's my government. I take orders from them, not from Washington. Okay, now the state has a certain contract they've agreed in 1782 or whatever year that was. They've agreed to delegate certain powers to Washington. But other than those specified powers that they delegate to the United States government, the primary sovereignty lies with the state. And so the state has the right, at least on its face, at first blush, it would seem the state has the right to do that. You could argue that it impedes interstate commerce, and therefore the federal government needs to get involved in this, but okay, that's fine with me. Either way, we need to basically stop people from leaving infected states going to uninfected states. So that could have been done. But how do you do that? Okay, so the most obvious method to do that is for Governor DeSantis saying, we're not accepting any planes from New York. So if you're trying to travel by plane from New York to Florida, which is a common thing that people do during this season of the year and all seasons of the year, we're just not doing that. You can't land in New York State. I don't give you permission. Sorry. Go somewhere else. And this is certainly something that would have prevented a lot of infections here in the state of Florida if DeSantis had done it early enough. There probably would have been a lot of criticism at the time, but that's certainly something he could have done. But keep in mind, though, that people could have also come by car. Okay, so car travel is far more difficult to ban because how are you going to do it? Are you going to do it, let's say, by a New York license plate, right? That's not really that effective because what about a New Jersey license plate? And that New Jersey person has been in New York yesterday. Okay, so you're going to ban New Jersey too? What if you, for whatever reason, your car is not registered in the tri-state area? And secondly, who's actually going to, have a license plate reader and actually apprehend each car that has a plate from New York or New Jersey or Pennsylvania or whatever? So that's a very unwieldy type of thing to do, to try to literally stop any car from entering. And there's other variations of this. I mean, you could have, for example, a patrol standing on the I-95 as soon as they hit Florida, and everyone would literally have to come to a stop, and they would have to, they would be asked questions. Where are you from? Regardless of their license plates. There's a lot of variations, but none of these are 100% fail-safe. I mean, people will slip in, mostly unintentionally, but some of the people will do it intentionally. They have the coronavirus, they're aware that they have it or had it, and they just want to leave the state because they want to get away, they want a vacation, and they just don't care. People are selfish; they don't care, and they'll do it anyway. Yes, people are like that, and we're never gonna know. We would never know. We, meaning the state, the government, would never know that they're doing it, and they're gonna come in and then contaminate others. So that really doesn't. I mean, so I say we could have done that, but wouldn't have been that practical. So what does this leave us with? As you can see at this point, the more we try to make this like a really watertight ship, right, that not a single drop of water should enter this ship, the more we fail. The more we run into greater and greater, more formidable and more problems that we cannot overcome. Which brings me to the final conclusion, which is that you just cannot deal with this virus by trying to quarantine the virus. It just doesn't work. This whole quarantine idea is a pie in the sky idea. It just doesn't work. The reason I went on for the last 13 minutes discussing all these different quarantining methods, quarantining the virus in Wuhan, in China, in Europe, in America, in New York, all of these things, they just don't work. They just don't work. Like I said, rewind the video. None of these options really, really work. A lot of the reason why they don't work is because at the time that you're doing it, the problem isn't severe and extensive enough for it to be sensible to actually do it. For that to be a political will to do it, right? So that's part of the reason. But also, it's just not practical. How long are you going to do it, right? If we indeed shut off the border, for example, and nobody can enter from any other country, including Europe, right? How long are you going to do it? Until there is absolutely no person in China who has it? So you know what I'm saying? So like I said, there is no practical solution, which brings me to the conclusion that we cannot quarantine the virus. So we're going to go to option B, what we could have done. So what we could have done is we could have said as follows, and this is already past at the point of no return. So this is at the point where the virus is already spread in New York. It's already in Washington State. It's already in who knows what other states. And what are we going to do now? Close off all those states? No, ain't happening. Okay, so what could we have done? So in my opinion, there's several mistakes that we made. Number one, the case fatality rate that New York State Governor Cuomo was worried about had no basis in reality. Okay, at the time, I remember when they were saying, oh, we need 30,000 ventilators. So that was based on a model, and he never discussed this. He wanted us to take him for his word on this. Oh yeah, we need it. That's what the experts said. It. Don't question me. It's not debatable. They said we need 30,000 ventilators, and I immediately questioned it. And he never disclosed the evidence for this. But it turned out that the evidence was based on a model that was predicated on a 2, 3, 4% case fatality rate. That about 3% of people who get the infection actually die from it. And even at the time, and this is an important assertion that I'm going to make right now, even at that time, this is the time when the virus was raging in Italy, there was no evidence for this. Any scientist worth their salt who actually believed that is disqualified in my eyes. It was just so obvious. I'm a layperson. I have no medical training. And at the time, when Governor Cuomo said 30,000 ventilators, if you don't believe me, look at my Facebook feed. At the time, I said, you're out of your mind. Not on the 30,000 ventilators, because I didn't know what data was based on. But I was saying to all these people who said, 3% of people are going to die, that's crazy. There is no evidence for that. Why? Very simple. Very, very simple. I knew it. Everyone knew it. It's just so obvious. Not every person who has it is going to get tested. It's just such a simple concept. They're not going to get tested. You're not going to be aware of every person who has it. So you can't just make an assumption that out of 100 people who have it, 3 people are going to die. Based on what? Based on 100 tests that you did and 3 people out of those tested died? I mean, how many people didn't you test? So that's crazy. We now know that a far smaller percentage of people die. Now, it's still higher than the flu. And I'm not negating, it's still a pretty harsh virus, but it's not as high as they were thinking. And so when they said 30,000 ventilators, they were out of their mind. There was no basis for it. So a lot of the stuff that we did at the very beginning of this crisis was based on just wrong data. I say wrong, I'm not just saying wrong by a hair, wrong by a mile. There's a big difference between a fatality rate of 3% and a fatality rate of 0.3%, because that's what it looks like right now. 0.3, something like that. I mean, I think that's the best guess that I would give it. That would be about 3 times the fatality rate of the influenza virus. So that's still bad, but it's not even close to what we thought, for no good reason. Okay. So what could we have done? So back to the question, what could we have done? Well, remember, they were talking about flattening the curve. But if you're only going to have 0.3% of New Yorkers infected, then you don't need to panic. You have enough beds. You have enough ventilators. By the way, it turns out the ventilators are not the answer to this anyway, and then you shouldn't put someone on a ventilator. And I have a lot of stuff that I can say about the topic of what could we and should we have done for people who develop early stages, early symptoms of COVID-19. But that's not the topic of this monologue. So suffice it to say that that even a person who has a very bad progression of the disease, the ventilator is not the answer. The ICU is not necessarily the answer. I know that in my ex-community in Borough Park and Williamsburg, it became so bad, the ICU environment became so bad, they were advising people not to go to the hospital. Crazy. They were saying, don't go, you're going to die there. And I have to believe that they did the right thing, because this was based on evidence on the ground. This was not, abstract stuff. So this was based on the outcome of people who did go to the hospital, and they were not treated properly. They were ignored. I'm hearing reports that the doctors just didn't want to touch them. And remember, there's no one to monitor what you're doing. You can easily say the guy died of coronavirus. Who's going to say otherwise? Who's going to say that he was neglected, right? There's no cameras. There's no nothing. There's no relatives, no friends can be present. And so, and you have the best excuse in the world. Hey, it's COVID-19. It's that bad. It's terrible. I'm overloaded. I have time. I don't have resources and all. And we've all seen these doctors crying on TV. I'm overwhelmed emotionally, blah, blah, blah. And that's the best excuse for not only being called a hero, but then actually letting your patient die. Yes, I am being cynical. I have no appreciation for these heroes. They're doing their fucking job, okay? They're getting paid 4 times as much as I getting paid. They're not a hero, okay? But anyway, I'm digressing. My point is that, where was I? Okay, so what we could have done. So like I said, so the first thing is don't panic. Secondly, so by don't panic, I mean literally, like emotionally, stay in control, because we panicked. We had a moment when, as a nation, and more specifically as a state, New York State panicked. A lot of the other states kind of followed suit because of New York. A lot of the stuff that we did nationwide was because of New York. Okay, so the first thing is don't panic. Secondly, you can't live in a bubble. So I remember watching this movie called The Boy Who Lived in a Bubble. So that's a movie from a while ago. It's probably at least 10, 15 years old. I'm not sure if it's still on Netflix or wherever I saw it. But it's essentially a story of a boy who had an immune deficiency, and he just couldn't handle with common bacteria that were just floating in the air. And he just had to be pulled in a sterile bubble. And he lived in that bubble, literally. And the parents were just very distraught about it, but that was the medical advice. That's the only way he'll survive. And he lived in that bubble, and for a long time, year after year, he grew to 4 or 5 years old, but he was miserable. He was absolutely miserable. He didn't have any friends. He couldn't play with anyone. And he was suicidal, I think, if I remember correctly. This is how bad he hated it. And then finally, the parents decided, you know what, we just can't go on, and we're not going to continue doing this. And the doctors were starting to question it, if this was the best, the best advice for this parent. And then finally, they decided they're going to take him out of the bubble and whatever, see what happens. Let him cope, let him live on his own. And the boy was really happy to get out of his bubble. And within a few days, he died. So yeah, he succumbed to the viruses and the bacteria around him. But the point being here is, and I remember watching this movie, and it left a very lasting impression, because it just shows you that you can't live in a bubble. Even if the alternative is to die, you just can't live in a bubble. And what we have done as a nation and as a people, starting with New York, is decided we're going to live in a bubble. We're all going to stay home. And originally they said, we're going to flatten the curve. But that's obviously bullshit, because the curve has been flattened a long time ago. And they haven't lifted the restrictions. And in fact, right now they're talking about not shaking hands, having 6 feet distancing for the indefinite future. This makes no sense. Based on the flattening curve concept, this is not, a corollary of that. This has nothing in relationship to that. This is just a whole new idea of, let's just overprotect ourselves from any and all viruses. Remember, we're dealing here with a virus that is only 2 to 3% as deadly as the influenza. With the influenza, you get almost no coverage, zero protection. Everything goes on as usual. People just blow their nose and shake their hands, etc. But now we're telling people, no, it's not enough. It's not enough to practice social distancing. It's not enough not to shake hands. It's not enough not to sit indoors in a restaurant. But you also have to not go to work at all. You also can't be in any gathering that there is 50 people. This is how insanely draconian the measures we are taking here. So there's obviously the advice that we're getting from the doctors and from our politicians, it's not in commensuration, in proportion to the reality, what is warranted by the facts. It just isn't. And so to go back to the question, what we could have done. So since we cannot live in a bubble, so what we should have and could have done is we could have had a controlled spread of the virus. So we could have said, okay, the people who are most vulnerable, we should shield them. They need to stay at home. They need to be quarantined. Another group of Americans that should be quarantined is obviously the people who have the illness themselves. Okay, don't go out and spread it. But anyone else, meaning about 80% of the population that are not over 75 or whatever, maybe it's not 80, whatever it is, but I'm certain that it's more than half. So the bulk of the population, you're not old, you don't have any underlying conditions, and you're not sick yourself. Just go about, do your freaking business. Do whatever you need to do. If you get it, you will survive. Not only will you survive, but you will build herd immunity by surviving. So now, not only did you survive it, but now you're immune. You cannot be a carrier anymore because now you have antibodies against it. So now, Now the people who do get it in the future cannot transmit it as much as they could at this point when you don't have herd immunity. And also the people who are most vulnerable to dying from it are not going to be as exposed in a future where you have herd immunity as they are exposed to it right now when we don't have herd immunity. Instead, what authorities have said, stay at home, quarantine yourself. Even if you're completely healthy, quarantine yourself, don't go out, don't possibly get the COVID-19. And so now what we have is a very gradual uptick in cases. I've looked up the data in Florida, and it's going up, but very slowly. So it's not doubling. If we didn't have any quarantine at all, then it would have doubled every few days. And so now it's not doubling. It's a very, very slight uptick. Whom does that benefit? It makes no sense at all. The hospitals, by the way, are empty here. I'm in Tampa. There's been about 1,000 confirmed cases in Tampa, and it's going up like very, very slow. It was 600. It was 500 3 weeks ago. Okay, that is very slow. Okay, that's not how it's supposed to go up a lot faster. So the quarantine works, obviously, but a lot of other things could have worked. And besides, who said the proper solution is to prevent everyone from getting it? Like I said, living in a bubble is not the solution. What you need is herd immunity. So if enough people get it, especially since we already did the shutdown anyway. Now, in my opinion, we should not have we should have not have done the shutdown, right? We should have kept the economy open, and we should have allowed, like I said, the bulk of the people are young and healthy. We should have permitted them. If they don't want to take the risk, that's fine. But we should have allowed them, possibly encouraged them, but certainly permitted them to go about their daily business. But we didn't do that. We shut down the economy anyway. But now we're compounding that mistake by not letting individuals who choose to go that herd immunity route, who choose to be exposed and to develop those antibodies. We are not only that, but we're now suppressing those isolated incidents. So whenever somebody sees somebody hanging out with other, they immediately become suspicious. They become resentful. They report it to authorities. I know New York City has a snitch line. So not only are we doing the wrong thing, but now we're just trying to impose that on others, which again makes absolutely no sense. If you are quarantining yourself because you're afraid of the virus, either you have an elderly or vulnerable person in your household, or if you have it yourself, whatever the reason may be that you're quarantining yourself, you're not in contact with any of your friends, you're not in contact with your extended family, nobody. Now somebody else, you see your neighbor goes to his neighbor. How does that make you worse off? It doesn't. It actually makes you better, because if they, as a result of their negligence, get the coronavirus and they get sick, now they're going to be immune upon recovery. And then eventually, when you finally come out of your quarantine, I don't know if you ever will, but presumably you're not going to live like this forever. So when you finally come out of your quarantine, you will be safer as a result. So it's actually in your best interest for other people to disobey the quarantine. Not obey it, disobey. You want to obey it, assuming that you do. But you want other people to disobey it, right? Unless you care really much about them and you're really, really scared that they'll get it and they'll die. But other than that, if they're strangers, you don't want to snitch on them. You want them to take that risk, possibly get it, and then become immune. Okay? So we made a lot of mistakes. And so finally, to close off this monologue that I'm giving here, the last mistake that we made and what we could have done differently is essentially not imposing a forced economic shutdown. We should have only advised elderly, the weak, to stay home. Obviously, we're not going to force them. Nobody's going to stand in front of your house to prevent them from leaving. But we could have given them an advisory. Hey, the world's a dangerous place right now. Just stay indoors while the virus is raging outside until it subsides, until it goes away. At that point, you can come out and resume interaction with the world at large. That's what we should have done. We should have said to people who were obviously sick, stay at home. We could have given them certain benefits, possibly. We could debate that. Make it easier for them to stay at home without facing a penalty of loss of income. But either way, we could do that without shutting down the whole economy. So that was a big mistake. Okay, so thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.